Awesome. Natalie, thank you so much for joining. I know we've been trying to get on the same page, I think, since the summer.
Yes.
It's been crazy busy, but I'm so excited to have you on today to chat a little bit. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and what you do?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I know I'm so excited to be here. And so I'm Natalie. I'm a registered dietitian. I practice sports nutrition and eating disorder nutrition specifically for equestrian athletes. And yeah, that's what I do. I spend all my days with my horse and then talking about horses with other people and talking about food. So I love it.
Sounds good. Sounds good. What kind of got you into that specializing specifically with equestrians?
Yeah, so I grew up riding horses. I grew up with horses. I was I guess, like typical barn rat and spent all my free time at the barn. And I've also always just been a foodie. I've always loved food. I've always been really interested in just like nutrition in and of itself. And when I was in high school, I remember there was a point in which I actually wanted to go to college for like equestrian management, and unfortunately had some pretty negative experiences with horses pretty early on, and decided like I just want to keep them in my life for fun. Um, Still wasn't quite sure like what I wanted to do, and I dabbled in like some like accounting classes, and I thought maybe I want to be a vet. Maybe I thought I want to be like a dentist, anesthesiologist, literally just like the most random across the board things. But like in the background, just always been like on nutrition blogs, and I worked in restaurants for 10 years, starting at 15. And so my partner was actually like, could you just go to school for nutrition? And I'm like, I probably could. So I looked into that, and yeah, I started the journey to becoming a dietitian in Chicago, went to undergrad there at UIC, moved to Portland for grad school at Oregon Health and Science University. I took the horse stuff had to take a little bit of a backseat in undergrad, just being in downtown Chicago makes it very
Yes.
difficult. But horse country was a lot more accessible in Portland. So we actually ended up moving to a horse ranch, and it was just kind of a no-brainer once I was sitting for my board exam and passed and started working as a dietitian to combine my passions and fill what I saw was a needed gap in our sport. So yeah.
There's absolutely a gap there. I find like equestrians as like our little cult that we've created for ourselves.
Yes.
It's hard to understand. Like it's not the same as a hockey tournament. It's not the same as like a football game or training. Like it's such a different type of demand.
Mhm.
And yeah, I definitely think, and until I found your page, absolutely was a hole in addressing nutrition needs for equestrians. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's forever shifting too. And
Right?
yeah, and just the more misinformation that's out there, and the more that we're unfortunately as a society kind of reverting back to the like 90s 2000s ways of thinking about food and bodies and all of that. It's an uphill battle, but just it's one step at a time. And just the more I can put in just accurate science-based um neutral information, hopefully the more it kind of counters the just like waves of misinformation that are probably not going to stop. So
I
yeah.
really love that you simplify it to like it's just food.
Yeah.
Like I love all the positive reinforcement that you put out there of it's just food and it's supposed to taste good and life is supposed to be fun and
Yes. Yep.
yeah.
We're supposed to enjoy it, and it's supposed
Yes.
to make you feel good. Yeah.
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 So with that, like you and I both very much openly share experiences with disordered eating on social media, and I chat about it with my clients quite regularly. Can you speak to the impact that has had and what you had to work through mentally and how you apply that with your clients as well?
Yeah. So I I feel like a lot of people who struggle with that, they don't realize in the moment that they're struggling with that. And so I, looking back, I'm like, oh my gosh, I was in it for years. And it really started with in high school for me. I was trying to eat quote unquote perfectly, like super clean all week, eating, what I thought was healthy based on the blogs that I'm reading, which that's a whole nother rabbit hole I can go into. But just like low carb, low fat, low calorie, just all the things which we know is unhealthy in many ways. Um, and I was, seen as the like nutrition person that my friends were coming to, which is also just wild. Like I'm a high schooler reading like blogs, please don't. But I was just, I thought that I was doing everything correctly. I was so into it. That's part of what got me into or led me to studying nutrition was I've always been fascinated by nutrition itself. But I was never like a huge like science person early on. The way that nutrition was painted in like all the blogs that I was reading and my understanding of it was this like fun thing, not as deeply science-based as it actually is, and I've learned it to be. Um, but so yeah, I was just stuck in that, eating perfectly or trying to eat perfectly during the weekdays. Friday would roll around and I would, end up overeating and really binging all of the things that I was restricting or that I was limiting either physically or psychologically during the week. My friends and I would go out, and have like essentially like binges together. And we would all have the same conversation of like, our diet starts tomorrow. Let's just we had one cookie, we might as well finish the box, and we would. And then we'd feel terrible. I would feel awful and I'd wonder why I did. And I'd always attribute it to the food. And it would only falsely reinforce, like, okay, the food, like clearly cookies are the issue or whatever it was, because I'm feeling this terrible. But I'd also probably feel that terrible if I ate like an entire like box of lettuce. Like it's not the food, right? And so I was in that cycle for years. Even in the first like year of undergrad, I remember I was always very into fitness as well, and just like grew up and I rode, but I also did other sports. So just significantly under fueling based on the amount of energy I was putting out. And again, thinking that I was doing what I considered to be healthy. Um, and it wasn't until I really started to learn and understand the science of nutrition and, from really a molecular level, but also understanding the repercussions of under eating, under fueling, not eating enough. I've always been really interested in sports nutrition. And, there's a whole body of literature looking at it's called RED-S, relative energy deficiency and sports syndrome. And that's really just this mismatch of you're under eating based on the amount of energy you're putting out. And it could be intentional, it could be unintentional. In my case, it was intentional. And as I started to really understand like, oh, that's why I'm having a hard time like focusing and my energy was low and I was relying on caffeine to no end. And like developed iron deficiency because I was over caffeinating, under eating, like just not not good. Um, so once I understood the science of it, and then as soon as I had one rotation later on where we talked about I had intuitive eating introduced, and at that point I was like, oh, like everything just like clicked, and connecting the science, connecting the psychological and the like understanding the psychology and physiology behind dieting and what led to those binges and what led to just everything that was not great. I was able to really kind of lean into that and that, that was very healing. And it took time. It took a lot of unlearning and reframing the way that I thought about food and just our society as a whole. And it's one of the reasons I've like continued and trained in, the like eating disorders and things that we haven't had formal training with in school, unfortunately. Um, but yeah, it was really just very long story long, being able to learn, understand the science and connect it with, see how intuitive eating connected all of that and practicing it myself. So yeah.
I can relate to all of that. The
Yeah.
absolutely perfect, like quote unquote perfect all week. And then
Yeah.
I hate the phrase cheat day.
Mm-hmm.
That just haunts my entire like high school, start of
Yeah.
university experience of, oh, it's my cheat day. I can eat like absolutely whatever I want. And
Yeah.
eating an entire box of cookies and as soon as you start to change it of like, I used to not be able to quote unquote have a box of cookies in the house because I'd eat the whole thing.
Yeah.
And now being able to have a box of cookies and be like, oh yeah, I forgot that was in there because I can have
Yeah.
them where I want. Such
Yeah. Yeah. Whenever I talk to clients about that, they're like, that's just never going to work for me. Like, that's just, and it's valid. Like if someone told me that when I was in the, my like binge restrict, overeating cycle, no, like that I'd look at whoever would have told me that, like they had three heads.
yeah.
But yeah, it's
You mean I
exactly
can have
like,
a cookie on a Tuesday?
yes, yes. And
What a
you can have,
Tuesday.
and you can enjoy it and you
Yes.
can move on and it doesn't have to take up like all your brain space. And it's obviously so much easier said than done, but it's very freeing when you are able to work past that or just work through it. Yeah.
But I find, especially with athletes, like I just had this conversation with a young hockey player that I'm working with, and he was saying like he doesn't feel like his muscles are recovering. So technically my undergrad is in nutrition.
Oh, cool.
I'm not a dietitian, but technically it's in nutrition a million years ago. But he was talking. I was like, oh, like what are you eating? And he was going through of like egg whites and like, I'm like, you are 17. Like, first of all, have the whole egg. First of all.
Yeah.
It's just so I know, and like he's trying so hard, but like it's
Yeah.
his parents doing like reading some like again blogs of like what healthy eating is and like what athletes might need. And I was like, you would be better to eat the whole egg, throw some bacon on there. Like you're not
Yeah.
getting enough calories or enough like carbs, nutrition in general to
Yeah.
actually support your muscles for that recovery.
Yeah.
But that he was like looking at me again, like I had three heads, and he's like, really? I was like, yeah, like you
Yeah.
need more.
Yeah. It's so funny because obviously we're talking about equestrians, but I work with, just like Luna says hi if you can hear her in the background. I work with just athletes like across the board in different sports. And last week I met with a basketball player for the second time, high school basketball player, and it was the same thing. He was experiencing DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, and was sore for days at a time. It was impacting his performance. And we walked through what he's eating. And same thing. I'm like, you gotta eat more, number one. Number two, we have to add we super need to up the carbs.
Yes.
Need to up the protein. We need to make sure you're having like some sort of a pre-fueling snack. And we went through it. I was in session with his mom too, and she's like, well, what should that be? And I'm like, could be applesauce, gummy bears, like
Yeah.
whatever. And fortunately, there wasn't any like diet culture surrounding that. There was questioning like the carbs because that
Yeah.
tends to be the most misunderstood macronutrient, but the most necessary for sports nutrition, especially. And I met with him again, and he's like, yeah, like I'm like barely sore. And it's just, it's amazing. It's science. Like it's not
Yes.
magic, it's science. And when you can lean into it and, just it's as simple as eating enough and eating balanced, but people like to overcomplicate and scare the crap out of everybody, which
Yeah.
makes my job so much harder than it has to be. But yeah.
You had mentioned intuitive eating. Can you explain what that is and how someone can start to implement that?
Yeah. So intuitive eating is a self-care approach to food and nutrition. So it was created by two dietitians in the 90s who basically created it in response to having clients coming to them not seeing quote unquote results or not being able to maintain results. And they started to, really look into like why, and explore the psychology and physiology behind dieting and under eating, and how that, how the body responds to that. And basically, we now know dieting doesn't work. It's largely unsuccessful for most people. And so they went on to create what's now an evidence-based approach to food and nutrition, and it's rooted in 10 principles. So the idea behind it is to strengthen interoceptive awareness, and that's just your body's ability to listen, recognize, and learn how to respond to internal body cues, without questioning it. And really essentially turning the volume down on external cues and being able to trust, like knowing what to eat and what works for you, regardless of, trying to change your body, or regardless of food rules or diet culture, just things you hear in the media. And there's a misconception that it's thought of as this, like, you only eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, or it's an invitation to eat like a free for all and with no regard to your health or how you feel. And it is so much more nuanced to that than that. There's, a lot of it is just building awareness around like, okay, what does your relationship to food look like? Are you able to recognize your hunger and fullness cues? Can you recognize the nuances in them and differentiate physical hunger from emotional hunger, from you're just like out and like something sounds like it tastes good and you want like a taste or two of it. And, being able to eat to satisfaction without being stressed around what you're eating and how you feel. And with athletes, there's another added layer of complexity because we can't always rely on our like for like equestrians showing, for example, if you have show nerves, that doesn't mean that your body doesn't need energy. It just means we have to, get creative and navigate the lack of hunger cue and what can you eat so that your body gets the energy, but it doesn't feel uncomfortable, which is understandable if you don't feel hungry. So it's a lot of nuance, but it's a non-diet approach. The focus isn't on weight gain or loss or maintenance or like weight at all. It's on genuine physical and emotional health. And there's almost 200 studies looking at its benefits for both. So yeah, it's a great approach for anybody, even taking bits and pieces of it.
I remember telling one of my equestrians, so like she was super anxious before shows. She couldn't eat,
Yeah.
and she would like feel like she had brain fog going into her course. I'm like, okay, like what do you feel like you could eat? And I remember giving her permission, quote unquote permission, to have a
Yeah.
bagel because she's just like all I want is like starchy carbs. And I was like, then eat a starchy carb. That sounds great. That's great, like fuel for your
Yeah.
brain. That will help. And she's just like, well, I can't eat a bagel. She's like, that's so much. I'm like, a sounds delicious. Like,
Yeah.
you want to smother it with peanut butter? That sounds good too. Add a banana, and then you're like really good to go.
Like that is exactly what you should be eating,
That's exactly what you
actually.
should be eating beforehand.
Very intuitive. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember the next time she had a show and she sent me a photo. She's like, here I am with my bagel. And I was like, I'm very proud.
Yeah.
It's great. Like, how
That's
do you
awesome. Yeah.
feel? And she's like, I actually feel a little less anxious. I'm like, yes, because your body isn't starving.
Yeah. Yeah. And we know too, like being just underfueled literally has been shown to increase anxiety, and dieting has been, I mean, we know dieting increases anxiety. And so when you're keeping your body and your brain fueled and nourished and like that in and of itself, it is always, I've had a couple clients to tell me like, well, I just, nothing sounds good except like, I don't know, just like nothing sounds good. And I'm like, what about like Gatorade, but like with the sugar, you need the sugar's a point. Or like, could you do like applesauce or like gummy bears? And everyone, like it's just that simple carb. There's so much misinformation and fear mongering around simple carbs. And even though that's what they tell me, like they could stomach, and I'm like, well, there's actually a physiological reason for that. So let's lean into it. And it's it tends to be successful all the time. So yeah, it's always interesting what just, battling that misinformation will do if somebody is open to lean into that, which is, again, can be a lot easier said than done for many people.
I taught myself so like I used to have trouble having breakfast in the morning, and find like psychology figured out that that's trauma response. My body doesn't realize it's safe enough to feel hunger in the morning. So I used to train myself by having chocolate ice cream. Like I would have like a small bowl of chocolate ice cream just so that my brain was like, oh, okay, this is good. We can eat this. And then I would have something with a little bit more oomph to it, a little bit more substance to it. But like I was nauseous thinking of anything else, but I would have a little bit of chocolate ice cream, and then I was like, okay, now I could have some eggs, or I could have something else. But I could not spark my brain to comprehend consuming anything first thing in the morning. And sharing that with a client, she's just like, you had chocolate ice cream for breakfast? I'm like, yeah, every day this week so far, I've had chocolate ice cream for breakfast.
There's no rules. Like, why not?
No rules. If there's nothing to say that that's better for me than having it after dinner. So
right. Yeah. Yeah. Something is better than nothing. So
exactly.
Yeah.
One of my big passions, and I like it's on some of my merch shirts, is everybody is an equestrian body. Part of that comes from I have a history as an instructor for a therapeutic riding stable, but a lot of that can come into the world in terms of I would say, lack of body inclusivity for size in the equestrian world. How do you think we can do a better job of being more size inclusive in that world?
Yeah, I absolutely love that, by the way. That is my, I love it. But I think the biggest thing, if anyone like takes anything away from like this question or piece of the conversation, is just don't comment on other people's bodies, like period. And whether it's intended to be complimentary, because that could be taken, and you never know how people internalize your comments. You know, if you compliment somebody's body, they might think, okay, that means I now have to stay at this size or whatever. And, you know, that can trigger some really unhealthy thinking and behaviors. Or, you know, if it's the other end of like body shaming, or, you know, coming out of oftentimes comments, depending on who they're coming from, tends to be out of a place of, again, either like trying to be complimentary or trying to be well-intentioned. And this is, I feel like it could be like a whole nother podcast, just the connection between like weight and health and all of that is, fat phobia is rampant in our society. It's even more rampant in sports, and even more rampant, I feel like, in our sport. And so just literally not commenting, just don't comment on anyone's bodies. Like that's it. And just don't comment on anyone's bodies.
For people people who I've talked to who have had, I don't want to say like the fortunate experience of not having disordered thoughts, like disordered eating thoughts, I don't think they understand how much someone who might be in that does take that personally. If you say, oh, you look great, and like it sounds ridiculous in the mental state that I'm in now, but like when I was in the middle of like that disordered eating world, like I would take that so seriously. Like if someone said I looked fantastic, I'd be like, okay, like I can't get any bigger. This is exactly, and it sounds ridiculous saying it now, but that really does stick. And a lot of the time, the compliments I would get on my body, I was like, I don't know if you know much of my medical history, but I have very extensive like medical past. So a lot of the times when people said I looked the best, I was in the worst health ever, and either like disordered eating or like on dialysis at one point. Everyone's like, oh, you look fantastic. I'm like, I am 107 pounds and living off of an ice cap because that is the only thing I can stomach. But it's like I got so many compliments all the time on that state, and I was like, you might think I look great, I don't feel very good. So, and in itself is like just don't
And I think too, like I've had this conversation with a lot of clients with just so much of the work that I do is just building awareness, because you can't change your thoughts or your behaviors without that initial awareness. And so just like being observant around like, okay, who is getting body shamed? It tends to be women. We don't see men ever getting body shamed. Or like having their weight talked about. And we also, it tends to be more prevalent in like the English disciplines than Western. And so it's very much a cultural thing. And I think like, you know, a lot of it is just, can you get like mad about that? Like that is, first of all, like the patriarchy, like digging its claws in again. But why is the conversation just around women? And, um, you know, I think unfortunately, again, like fat phobia just exists in general in our society, but and I work with athletes in other sports and especially in like aesthetic sports, there tends to be higher rates of eating disorders and disordered eating or sports where people have to make weight.
Mhm.
Um, and, you know, just like body shaming and just really unhealthy cultures around just the way that food and health and fitness and performance is discussed, like and it's so harmful. And then in our sport, there's obviously that, and we may not be like a purely aesthetic sport, although like equitation, I guess you could
Yeah.
argue is, but you know, people just always have that tends to be woven in there so much. And then we have an additional layer of people have then added like, well, what about like horse welfare? And I'm like, well, what about horse welfare? Like, are you commenting on the horse's fitness? Are you commenting on saddle fit, the fit of the bit? Like, are you looking at, I don't care what size of rider, what do their hands look like? Are they matched with a horse that is appropriate for them from a just, you know, like level perspective? Are they like what are they working on, you know, improving their like strength, et cetera? I don't care what the rider looks like. Are you focusing, like you should be focusing on the same things that is going to help with the comfort of the horse. And when you have soft hands and a light seat and you know that is going to be so much better and more effective for the horse in a rider who may be in a larger body than a rider who may be in a softer body that has harsh hands, is using a corrective bit and is like slamming on their back. So it's I think just like just getting angry about the narrative and conversation. Like, can
Doesn't
we?
get talked enough about,
Yeah,
I feel. And
yeah,
it's especially like when we put ourselves in a sport, like if you're in the show world, you're literally paying to be judged. So, first of all, you're really putting yourself out on display. And I don't think
yeah,
that your physical shell should be judged based off of that. And I have friends and clients who are judges, and it's so sometimes interesting, sometimes infuriating talking to them about that. I'm like, but all the ones that like are on the same page, they're like, it doesn't, like the size of the body doesn't interfere with the aids that I'm looking at, or like you said, like how soft are the hands, how is the horse responding, like how do they work with the horse, not size has nothing to do with that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think just like, yeah, a lot of the writers that I work with body image on, it is a lot of just like also kind of getting angry at like the narrative and knowing like this has nothing to do with you. Your body is never the problem. Our society is, and like how can we work on you feeling your best? Um, and I think it like all goes back to just not commenting on somebody's body to begin with is just gonna make like such a difference. Like it's such a small thing that can make such a difference.
I agree entirely.
Yeah.
So, with our lovely equestrian world, stress and anxiety are common themes.
Mhm.
What can equestrians do to help support their bodies through that stress and anxiety?
Um, so again, awareness. Just starting with like, and I'm a dietitian, so I talk about food and nutrition, of course, but I think it's important to also explore and understand what are the other factors in your life that impact your your food choices or choice like not to eat or whatever it might be. And so are you somebody who your appetite and hunger cues shut down when you have stress and anxiety? If that's the case, not, and this is where, like with intuitive eating, it's not like just eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, because you have to override your hunger cues in some cases, and that would be one of them. So if you're somebody who experiences stress and anxiety and hunger cues shut down, having, you know, maybe setting like external hunger cues through like an alarm clock and reminding yourself to eat, making sure you're eating consistently. Sometimes when we don't have an appetite, having smaller meals and snacks, but more frequently throughout the day can be more helpful than having maybe like 3 big meals and like a couple snacks or whatever. So just making sure that you're still fueling and nourishing your body, because being underfueled and undernourished is only going to heighten that anxiety and can worsen the stress. So that would be, my advice for that. And then if you're somebody who tends to turn to food to cope with food and with stress and anxiety, that's a whole nother conversation. But there's our society tends to try to disconnect food from emotion. And at the end of the day, food is just very inherently and naturally emotional. Like if you think about an infant in their and like a baby in their first year of life, every time they eat, they're being fed. They're not just being fed and put away, like they're being held. There's a layer of safety, security, comfort, happiness that is literally like woven into food from birth, essentially. And so it makes sense that some people might, really want to lean into that and use food as a way to cope. And so, with that, if you find that food is like your only or primary coping mechanism, I think seeing it as like one tool in a toolbox and maybe exploring other ways to cope with stress and anxiety, not taking food away, but just saying like, okay, are there other things I can do based on how I'm feeling right now, whether it's like calling a friend or like going for a walk, reading a book, whatever. And if you are wanting to lean into food, just trying not to be judgmental about that, really leaning into the self-compassion that I work on a lot with clients, and just working through that, getting the food that you enjoy and putting it on plates that are nice and incorporating a level of like mindfulness and enjoyment into it, so that when you remove that kind of judgment or the feeling of I shouldn't be doing this or whatever it might be, that can help ease any potential additional anxiety that might come up through eating to help with that anxiety. So, yeah, just a lot of consistency and self-compassion.
Right? I know. I feel like that summarizes it a lot of the
Yeah.
time. It's just a little bit of self-compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cortisol is a hot topic on social media right now. It's driving
Yeah.
me nuts. What are your thoughts?
Yes. So, I think like many things, there tends to be this like all or nothing way of thinking about stuff. And with cortisol, I think it's the discussion around it is it's this terrible thing that like you can't, like you have to lower your cortisol, and like cortisol is bad. In reality, cortisol is a steroid hormone and that's produced by your adrenal glands, and it's one of the hormones that's responsible for like kicking in your sympathetic nervous system through the fight or flight mode. And so it's necessary. It's what allows us to wake up. It's what helps with exercise and like, boosting your heart rate and getting the blood glucose to your muscles and all of that. It's necessary in times of like acute stress. But we do know that when your body is in a state of like chronic stress, both physical and psychological stress, that the cortisol, which is meant to be like has a specific purpose, and shouldn't, like the goal is not to not have cortisol, but is to, you know, want to control it so that it is there when you need it, but isn't always hanging around in the background, which can happen with like chronic stress. And so, stress management, just in general, working with like if you're somebody who does experience chronic stress, building awareness around that and like what's causing it. Would it be helpful to work with a therapist, or are there any stress reduction techniques that maybe you can work on incorporating? From like the role that it has in the body, because it does have a role in like activating the fight or flight response. It can essentially trigger something called gluconeogenesis, and pull protein, from your muscle, turn that protein into a carb into glucose essentially, and can increase just like blood sugar levels through that process, which we need in that fight or flight state. But if your body is always sensing it's in a fight or flight state, you may not always need it. It can suppress your immune system because it does have anti-inflammatory, um, uh, it has anti-inflammatory roles, but it can impact your immune system. It can impact the gut. There's this huge body of research that's continuing to grow, looking at the connection between the gut and the brain. And we know that chronic stress can change the environment in the gut and lead to dysbiosis. And that can in turn create this kind of cyclical effect and impact the brain, and can like increase stress and anxiety. And so from just like a food perspective, I feel like the best advice is always really like simple and not exciting, but just eat a balanced diet. If you work like, and when I say diet, like dietary pattern, I don't believe in like dieting. But making sure every meal has, carbs, trying to make half of your grains over the day, whole grains, incorporating, lots of different fruits and vegetables and different proteins and omega-3s and fats throughout the day, not skipping meals, eating consistently. And there's some supplements that are in this class of like adaptogens where they help with like managing the stress response. It's like ashwagandha is one, but I don't always recommend it for everyone. And it's not intended to be taken like forever. So it shouldn't be something to super rely on. But yeah, I think like many things, it's very nuanced and it's really complex, and it's ultimately just self-compassion, but also like how can you, if you do find that you're in a really high stress state all the time, what can you do to lower that or manage it even in like small doses throughout the day or like once a day. Yeah, lots of thoughts on cortisol.
And it's so funny how they've managed to take something that's literally always been part of our bodies and are now marketing it of you'll fix your whole world, or you'll all of a sudden slim your whole face if you just drink this, where I'm like, well,
Yeah.
probably not.
Yeah.
Probably not. Let's work on some other outer lifestyle.
Yes.
Yes.
How's your sleep? How's your overall stress? How's your relationship to food in your body? Because if it is negative and stressful, that's stress. And then you're trying to like manage that through food, then it's defeating the purpose and just adding more stress. And you have to eat multiple times a day. So that's a lot of stress every time you have to eat. Yeah. Yeah.
And then you're stressing about your stress, which for the record
Yes.
is going to increase your cortisol.
It's going to increase your cortisol. Yep. Yeah.
As a fellow equestrian in biz, how do you find balance between work, rest, your passions?
I have designated I try. Most weeks I do this, but I've designated like one day that I don't check any emails, that I'm not like it's my day. And I have recently gotten back into reading, which has been really nice. So just trying to like build that into my routine at the end of the day, and try to like shut my brain off from work instead of always responding or, being on the lookout for emails or just like trying to work on something. I try to set, I try to set time aside at the end of the day for just me time. And of course, going to the barn, I recently moved, and that's been helpful. So having Stella, my horse, a lot closer to me is really nice, and takes a lot of the stress away from just like commuting, the
Yes.
commute that I was doing. And yeah.
I love that I forgot that you also have like jumped down the rabbit hole of fantasy romance because that has
Yes.
been like, that's been so wild for me this year. Like I've always like at the end of the day, like will turn on the TV, but also like be scrolling through my phone while I'm eating dinner at the end of my evening. And ever
Yeah.
since I got into this whole world of reading, I now just read. And like the amount of time I've spent on my phone has decreased so
Yeah.
significantly. I haven't really watched a TV show like in almost a full year now. And
Yeah.
I'm now just like so in this world. And
Which, yeah. Which series got you into it?
I read Fourth Wing first.
Okay.
That was, and then I like went down the rabbit hole of like Fourth Wing, then like Akatar, and now it's just like I think I'm on my 90th book of the year, which I know, you know.
Oh,
I've
that is
also
impressive.
like I've like deep dived into like audiobooks now too, which I did not think I would be an audiobook person, but like
Yeah.
if I'm doing chores at the barn, I'll be like
Yes.
listening to my audiobook, or if I'm doing food prep, I'm listening to my audiobook.
Yeah.
Oh, and like literally anything that I'm doing that's mundane that I can do that at the same time. It's
Same.
wild how much it has now just adapted to my world. But for like my stress and my like I've noticed such a big difference in my ability to fall asleep and the quality of sleep I'm getting, because right before I would go to bed I would be watching, like I'd have something on in the background, I'd be scrolling at the same time, which
Right.
so bad in hindsight. But yeah, now if I'm just focusing on reading, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I'm sleeping really well. This is so nice.
Yeah. I've noticed that too. I've noticed that too. And it's so
Right?
funny. Yeah, I mean, that we'll have to talk more like offline about the book stuff because we could go into a whole thing about that, I think. But I finished the ACOTAR series and then it was right around like Halloween, and I'm a huge like seasonal person. So I'm
Yes.
like, okay, well, I have to read my Halloween book, and now like I want to read my like holiday books, and I have Throne of Glass waiting for me in
Yes.
January, and I'm like, I'm excited to read the seasonal stuff, but I'm just like chomping at the bit
I
to,
love that.
yeah, yeah. So
My sister's the same in terms of seasonal. I'm not as much, but like she's like a very I'm not a Scrooge, but she's like a huge holiday person where I'm like a
yeah,
medium holiday person. But she's
gotcha.
so pumped for she already has like all of her like cute little holiday rom-com books all set to go. And
Same. Yep.
I love it. I love it.
Amazing.
Any other tidbits, words of wisdom you would like to share?
I don't think so. I feel
Yeah.
like we can talk about a million different things forever. Just yeah, I feel like that we covered all of the like the main things that I talk about with
Yeah.
clients. I talk about, I mean, I think supplements is like a whole other thing, but
Yeah.
um yeah, other than that, I no, think that was all great.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been so wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.